A black father, devastated by the mysterious death of his 10-year-old daughter, found himself unable to accept the official explanation. In desperation, he decided to hide a camera inside her coffin. What he discovered in the footage was more than he ever expected. It shattered him and changed his life forever. Stay tuned and share in the comments where you're watching from. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the quiet suburban street where Marcus Johnson lived with his young daughter, Leah. Their neighborhood was plain, lined with modest homes, white fences, and tidy lawns. It was the kind of place where people exchanged polite smiles, but rarely delved deeper. Watching Leah play outside often reminded Marcus of this. She was everything to him, the bright star that kept him grounded after her mother had left them years before. That morning had seemed like any other. Leah sat at the kitchen table, drawing with her colored pencils, while Marcus busied himself frying eggs and sausage. She was sketching a scene of them together, a father and daughter standing under a tree, hand in hand. "Make sure you get my muscles right," Marcus teased, flexing dramatically as he slid her plate onto the table. Leah giggled and held up her half-done drawing. "You're the strongest dad in the world," she said, her grin lighting up the room. Marcus bent down to kiss her head. "Don't you ever forget it," he replied with a chuckle. It was the last time he'd hear her laugh, by the late afternoon. The playground buzzed with children's laughter and energy. Leah had begged Marcus to let her go, and though he hesitated, he eventually gave in. He'd planned to tackle some paperwork for the auto shop where he worked, but found himself distracted instead, constantly glancing at the clock. When the phone finally rang, Marcus already knew. Even before answering, a sense of dread filled him. The voice on the other end was calm, rehearsed. It belonged to a police officer. "Sir, we need you to come to Memorial Hospital right away. It's about your daughter," they said. The drive there felt like a blur to Marcus. He barely remembered it. The waiting room carried a heavy scent of antiseptic, mingling with the weight of despair. When the doctor finally appeared, her words cut through him like a blade. "We did everything we could," she said. Leah was gone. According to the official report, Leah had fallen from the jungle gym, hitting her head. A tragic accident, they explained. But Marcus hardly processed the words. His world had crumbled in an instant, leaving behind only emptiness. The funeral came together too quickly for Marcus to fully grasp what had happened. Friends and neighbors came by, offering their condolences, but their words felt empty. Lee's tiny coffin, painted white with gold trim, looked out of place among the rows of grey headstones in the cemetery. It wasn't until the wake that Marcus began noticing things that didn't feel right. Lee's body rested in the coffin, her face pale but peaceful, almost as though she was simply asleep. Yet, something gnawed at him. He couldn't ignore the bruises on her arms and legs, bruises that hadn't been mentioned in the autopsy report. He recalled the paramedics' hesitation when he asked questions, how their eyes shifted nervously, avoiding his gaze. At first, he told himself it was just his grief playing tricks on him, but the doubts persisted. The workers at the funeral home didn't help either. Marcus overheard their hushed jokes in the hallway, comments about making it quick and not wasting time on people like them. The words stung deeply. People like them. He understood the implication. Black families didn't ask questions. They didn't push back. Later, as Marcus leaned over Lee's coffin one last time, he noticed something else. Her small, delicate hands had dirt beneath the fingernails. Panic gripped him. He turned to his younger sister, Clara, who had flown in from Atlanta for the funeral. "She didn't have this dirt before," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why would there be dirt under her nails?" Clara glanced nervously toward the funeral workers before meeting Marcus's eyes. "You're exhausted," she said gently. "You've been through too much. Let's try to let her go." But Marcus couldn't let go that night. Marcus lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as every detail replayed in his mind. The bruises, the dirt, the laughter of the funeral workers. Something didn't feel right, and he couldn't push it away. By dawn, he had made up his mind. Driving to an electronics store, he purchased a small hidden camera. The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't ask any questions. Back home, Marcus carefully took apart the lining of the coffin, placing the camera inside and positioning it to capture the interior. It felt wrong, like he was violating something sacred, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Lee's death wasn't as simple as they claimed. Later, when Clara stopped by, Marcus told her what he'd done. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice rising. "You put a camera in her coffin? Marcus, you're spiraling." "What if I'm not?" he snapped back. "What if something happened and nobody cared enough to look closer because we're black? What if they just wrote her off?" Clara's expression softened, though her eyes still held worry. "And if you're wrong? What then?" "Then I'll live with that," Marcus said firmly. "But at least I'll know I didn't give up on her." That night, Marcus sat in front of his computer, watching the live feed from the camera. The screen showed only darkness, the closed interior of the coffin. Hours went by with nothing happening. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he should turn it off and allow himself to grieve. But when the clock struck midnight, something strange caught his eye, a faint flicker of movement, so subtle he thought it might be a glitch. Leaning closer to the screen, his heart raced. There it was again, a shadow passing across the frame, followed by the muffled sound of something scraping against wood. Marcus's stomach dropped, but he couldn't look away. Marcus remained frozen in front of the screen, his eyes locked on the dim, grainy footage. At first, he convinced himself it had to be a glitch. Cameras malfunction all the time, poor connections, bad lighting, maybe even a reflection. But the scraping sound continued, faint yet distinct, and it churned his stomach. With trembling hands, he rewound the recording, dragging the timeline slider back just a few minutes. Leaning so close to the monitor that his breath fogged the screen, he watched again. There was no mistaking it now. The camera inside Lee's coffin had captured something. His heart pounded as he forced himself to keep watching. The faint movement reappeared, barely noticeable, like fabric shifting ever so slightly. Then the scraping noise returned, irregular but deliberate. Every rational thought in his mind urged him to stop, whispering excuses. Faulty equipment, interference from cemetery wiring, maybe even an animal. But none of it made sense. This was inside Lee's coffin, her coffin. Marcus leaned back, rubbing his temples as memories of the funeral flooded his mind. The rushed preparation of her body, the dirt under her fingernails, the unexplained bruises. All the little details he tried to ignore now came together, forming a web of doubts he couldn't untangle. Unable to resist, Marcus hit play again, this time putting on headphones and cranking the volume high enough to catch every sound. That's when he heard the voices. Faint, distant at first, like they were coming from another room. The recording captured a low murmur, followed by brief bursts of laughter. He paused the video, straining to listen. The words were faint but chilling. Quick. They won't even notice. Marcus felt his stomach lurch. He rewound the recording and played it again, focusing on the background noise. Adjusting the volume, the voices became clearer. "Don't make it harder than it has to be. Just get it done. What's the point? They'll never check." The voices were calm, indifferent, and unmistakably discussing Leah. Marcus shot up from his chair, pacing the room as panic surged through him. He pressed his palms against his forehead, desperately trying to make sense of what he had just heard. This couldn't be real. He must have misunderstood. But the more he replayed it in his mind, the clearer it became. Someone had tampered with Lee's body. He returned to his computer, his hands shaking as he copied the file onto 3 different flash drives. Then he uploaded it to the cloud and emailed it to himself, determined to ensure it wouldn't be lost. His first instinct was to call the police, but he hesitated. What would he even say? That he had hidden a camera in his daughter's coffin because he didn't trust the system? That the footage contained shadows and faint whispers? They'd dismiss him as a grieving father unable to face reality. No, he needed more proof. The next morning, Marcus went to the funeral home. The director, an older white man with a permanent frown, greeted him in a dimly lit office. "Mr. Johnson," the man said, folding his hands on the desk, "I'm sorry for your loss. What can I do for you today?" Marcus struggled to keep his voice steady. "I need to ask about some irregularities with my daughter's body." The director's expression didn't waver. Irregularities? There were bruises that weren't in the report, Marcus said, his voice tense, and dirt under her nails. "Can you explain that?" Leaning back in his chair, the director replied, "Bodies go through natural changes during preparation. Bruising is common, and sometimes residue gets trapped under the nails. I assure you, it's nothing unusual." Marcus clenched his fists. "That's not good enough." The director's gaze hardened. "I understand your grief, Mr. Johnson, but I must ask you to respect our staff and the difficult work they do. If you'd like to file a formal complaint." Marcus didn't wait for him to finish. He stormed out, his anger boiling. The way the director brushed him off only solidified Marcus's suspicions. Later that day, Marcus called Clara and asked her to come over. She arrived within an hour, her face tight with worry. "You're scaring me, Marcus," she said, sitting down on the couch. Without hesitation, Marcus showed her the video. By the time it ended, Clara's hands were trembling. "This is insane," she whispered. "What are we supposed to do with this?" "We go to the police," Marcus said firmly. "We show them the video and demand they reopen the investigation." Clara hesitated. "What if they don't believe us?" "Then we keep pushing," Marcus replied, his voice resolute, "until someone does." That evening, they drove to the police station. Marcus brought one of the flash drives and explained the situation to the officer at the front desk. The officer frowned but agreed to take a look. 30 minutes later, the detective assigned to the case came out, his expression unreadable as he handed the flash drive back to Marcus. "This doesn't prove anything," the detective said flatly. "The audio is unclear, and the shadows could just be shifting light or camera interference. I'm sorry, but there's nothing here to warrant reopening the case." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. "You didn't even listen to the whole thing," he snapped. "We listened to enough," the detective replied. "I suggest you focus on grieving rather than chasing conspiracy theories." Leaving the station in a daze, Marcus's anger simmered just beneath the surface. Clara tried to console him, but her words barely registered. It was clear. The police wouldn't help. If Marcus wanted answers, he'd have to find them himself. That night, Marcus sat in the dark, his eyes glued to the monitor as the footage played on a loop. The voices echoed in his mind. "They won't even notice. Just get it done." Over and over, those words replayed until they drowned out every other thought. He couldn't stop thinking about Leah, her smile, her laughter, the promises he had made to protect her. He knew this was just the beginning. Marcus didn't sleep that night. The faint glow of the computer screen lit up his face as he watched the recording for the 6th time. His ears strained to catch every sound, every shift in noise. But the words haunted him most. "Don't make it harder than it has to be. Just get it done. They'll never check." The voices looped endlessly in his mind, and with each replay, his determination burned brighter. The detective's dismissal had only fueled his resolve. They wanted him to grieve quietly, to let it go, but he couldn't. He wouldn't. Lee's face came to him in flashes, her wide smile as she showed him her drawing, her laughter when she teased him about his cooking. She deserved better than this. By morning, Marcus had a plan. He called Clara and asked her to come over. When she arrived, he barely gave her time to settle before he began speaking. "They won't help us," Marcus said, pacing the living room. "The police won't even look at the evidence. So, we're going to find someone who will." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Who exactly?" "Everyone we've spoken to so far has written this off as paranoia." Marcus paused, biting his lip. "The media," he said finally. "We'll go public. If we can't get answers the right way, we'll force their hand." Clara hesitated. "Are you sure about this, Marcus? Once it's out there, you can't take it back. People might attack you for it, or worse, twist it into something it's not." "I don't care," Marcus said sharply, then softened. "I can't let this go, Clara. If they covered something up, if they let her die because of negligence, or worse, then we can't let them hide it." Reluctantly, Clara agreed. Later that day, Marcus began contacting local news stations, leaving messages for every reporter he could find. Hours passed without a single response, and desperation began to set in. Finally, a young journalist named Julia Reyes called him back. "I saw your email," she said, "and I watched the footage." Marcus gripped the phone tightly. "There's definitely something strange going on," Julia continued, "but this isn't going to be easy. Funeral homes don't just open coffins after burial without permission, or without a good reason." "They didn't have permission," Marcus said quickly. "I would have known." "Then we need more evidence," Julia replied. "Meet me tomorrow. Bring everything you have." Hanging up, Marcus felt the first flicker of hope since Lee's death. The following day, Marcus and Clara met Julia at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Julia was younger than Marcus had expected, mid-twenties, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "I want to help," she said, pulling out a notepad, "but if we're going to run this story, we need to dig deeper. We'll need proof of negligence or a motive." Over the next several days, Julia started piecing things together. She uncovered complaints against the funeral home, detailing mishandled bodies and falsified records. Although Marcus wasn't surprised, the revelations still sent chills down his spine. At the same time, Marcus and Clara focused on tracking down former employees who might be willing to talk. After facing several dead ends, they finally found someone. Kevin Forster, a man in his 40s who had left the funeral home under questionable circumstances. They met Kevin late one evening at a diner. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room. "I don't know what you expect me to say," he began, fidgeting with his coffee cup. "The truth," Marcus said, leaning forward. "My daughter's body was tampered with after the funeral. I need to know why." Kevin's hands trembled slightly. "You think you're the first one?" Marcus froze. "What do you mean?" Kevin swallowed hard. "They've been doing this for years. Cutting corners, covering up mistakes. Sometimes it's sloppy embalming. Other times, it's worse." Clara leaned in. "Worse how?" Kevin hesitated before finally replying. "They reuse caskets. Swap out bodies to save space. Sometimes they damage the remains and try to fix them in a hurry. If your daughter's body was moved, it's because they were hiding something." Marcus's stomach churned. He wanted to scream, but forced himself to stay calm. "Will you go on record?" Julia asked, breaking the tense silence. Kevin shook his head quickly. "I can't. They'll come after me." "They've already come after me," Marcus said quietly. "They vandalized my car, sent threats. They made it clear they don't want me asking questions. But I'm not stopping." Kevin studied Marcus for a long moment before sighing. "I'll think about it," he said, then left the diner in a hurry. Over the following week, Julia continued to push the investigation forward. She discovered records that revealed Lee's embalming process had been rushed and incomplete. The funeral home had altered documents to make it appear routine, but the discrepancies were glaring. Finally, Julia published her first article. It detailed Marcus's suspicions, the recording, and the funeral home's questionable history. The story quickly spread, sparking outrage within the community. People began sharing their own experiences of neglect and discrimination. However, with the attention also came danger. One night, Marcus woke up to find the words, "Stop digging," spray-painted across his garage door. His phone rang incessantly with blocked numbers, some leaving menacing messages. Clara begged him to stop, but Marcus was resolute. "We're too close," he told her. "They're scared. That means we're doing something right." Under increasing pressure from the media, the police reluctantly reopened the investigation. Marcus watched as the process dragged on, painfully slow. Meanwhile, Julia uncovered a deeper connection. One of the funeral home's owners had ties to local hospitals, raising suspicions about referrals and profits. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. One evening, as he and Clara reviewed their evidence, his phone buzzed. It was Kevin. "They're coming after me," Kevin said, his voice shaky. "I need protection. I'll testify, but you have to help me." Marcus's blood ran cold. He agreed to meet Kevin the next day, but deep down, he knew the danger was far from over. Looking at Lee's unfinished drawing, the one she had left on the table the day she died, his resolve hardened. He wouldn't let her down. Not now. Not ever. Marcus barely slept the night before the hearing. He sat in his living room, surrounded by piles of documents, recordings, and scribbled notes. The clock ticked toward dawn, but he didn't notice the time. His mind raced, filled with thoughts of Leah, the funeral home, and everything it had taken to get to this point. The threats hadn't stopped. Anonymous calls still came late at night, their voices low and menacing. "You'll regret this," one caller had hissed. Marcus simply hung up and started recording every future call. He was beyond fear now. All he cared about was seeing this through. Kevin Forster, the former funeral home employee, had finally agreed to testify in court. His decision came with risks. Kevin had already lost his job and now feared for his safety. Marcus had offered him a place to stay, but Kevin declined, opting to move in with a cousin outside the city. "Just keep pushing," Kevin had told Marcus before leaving. "Don't let them bury this." Those words haunted Marcus. Don't let them bury this. When Marcus arrived at the courthouse the next morning, the atmosphere was electric. Protesters lined the steps, holding signs that read "Justice for Leah" and "No More Neglect." Journalists crowded the entrance, thrusting microphones toward anyone who looked important. Clara met him at the doors, clutching his arm tightly. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. Marcus nodded, though his stomach twisted in knots. He wasn't ready. He'd never be ready for this, but he couldn't back down now. Inside the courtroom, tension hung thick in the air. The funeral home's lawyers sat stiffly at their table, dressed in tailored suits and surrounded by assistants. Across from them, Marcus sat with his attorney, Angela Reed, a no-nonsense woman recommended by Julia Reyes, the journalist who had broken the story. Angela leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. No matter what they throw at you, don't lose your temper. Marcus nodded, gripping the edge of the table as the judge entered the room. The opening statements were harsh. The funeral home's lawyers painted Marcus as a grieving father whose judgment had been clouded by paranoia. They dismissed the hidden camera footage, calling it unreliable and inadmissible. The audio, they claimed, was distorted, and the shadows could have been caused by poor lighting or camera interference. Angela countered with hard facts. She highlighted Lee's unexplained bruises, the dirt beneath her nails, and the funeral home's history of complaints. Then she played the recording for the court. The whispers filled the room, their casual cruelty slicing through the air. Don't make it harder than it has to be. Just get it done. They'll never check. Marcus watched the jury's reactions closely. Some flinched, others turned away, and a few stared straight ahead, their expressions hardening. Then Kevin took the stand. At first, his voice wavered, and his hands fidgeted nervously. But as he continued, his confidence grew. He described the funeral home's practices in vivid detail, how they reused caskets, swapped bodies, and covered up their mistakes. They told us no one would notice, Kevin said, gesturing toward Marcus. Especially not families like his. The room went silent. Marcus's heart pounded. He knew the weight of Kevin's words could shift everything. The defense tried to discredit Kevin, pointing to his termination and suggesting he had a personal vendetta against the funeral home. But Kevin stood his ground, refusing to back down. By the time the closing arguments were finished, Marcus felt utterly drained. The judge called for a recess, and Marcus stepped outside to catch his breath. Clara followed, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "No matter what happens," she said softly, "you fought for her." Marcus swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "It's not enough," he said quietly. "Not yet." 3 days later, the courtroom was packed as the jury returned with their decision. Marcus held his breath as the foreperson stood to announce the verdict. "Guilty," she said. Relief washed over Marcus, but it didn't last long. The funeral home was ordered to pay damages, and several employees, including the director, faced criminal charges. Yet, the verdict couldn't bring Leah back. After the sentencing, Marcus visited her grave. The cemetery felt different now, less oppressive, but the weight in his chest remained. Kneeling by the headstone, he traced his fingers over her name. "I did it, baby," he whispered. "I made them see you." A few steps away, Clara stood quietly, giving him space. When he finally stood, she slipped her hand into his. "They can't hurt anyone else now," she said. Marcus nodded, though the ache in his heart lingered. In the weeks that followed, Marcus worked to create something meaningful from his loss. With Clara's help, he started the Leah Johnson Foundation, a non-profit focused on addressing discrimination and negligence in healthcare and funeral services. Julia Reyes continued to report on the story, keeping the public's attention on the case and advocating for legislative change. The threats eventually stopped, but the fear Marcus had felt during those long nights stayed with him. He kept the hidden camera that had sparked everything, a reminder of the fight he'd won, and the daughter he'd lost. One afternoon, while cleaning Lee's room, Marcus found her unfinished drawing, the one of them standing under a tree. He framed it and hung it in the living room. Below the picture were the words she'd written, "Always together, Dad." As Marcus stepped back to look at it, tears welled in his eyes. But this time they weren't just tears of grief. They were filled with love, hope, and the promise he had fulfilled. One afternoon, Marcus stepped outside, letting the warm breeze brush against his face. For the first time in months, it felt like he could breathe again. Leah was gone, but her memory remained alive, and so did the fight for justice she had inspired. As he stood beneath the setting sun, Marcus knew the battle wasn't over. There were still families like his, who needed someone to stand up for them. And he was ready.